Two men, no ship, no rescue team, no radio. Just the frozen Arctic Ocean, polar bears circling in the darkness, and 900 kilometers of ice standing between them and the nearest human being. This is not fiction. This happened in 1895, and the man at the center of it chose this situation deliberately. Who was Fridtjof Nansen? Before we talk about survival, you need to understand the kind of man Fridtjof Nansen was, because ordinary men do not do what he did. Nansen was Norwegian, born in 1861. By the time he was 28 years old, he had already done something no human being had ever done. He crossed the entire Greenland ice sheet on skis, not along the edge, across it, from east to west, through one of the most brutal frozen landscapes on Earth. The world called him a hero. He called it practice. Because Nansen had a bigger target in mind. He wanted the North Pole. Now, here is what you need to understand about the North Pole in 1895. Nobody had ever reached it. Nobody even knew exactly where it was. The Arctic Ocean was a mystery, an unexplored, frozen, deadly mystery. Ships had tried to reach it and been crushed by the ice. Expeditions had turned back. Men had died. But Nansen had a theory, a radical, controversial, scientifically brilliant theory that almost nobody believed. He noticed that wreckage from an American ship called the Jeannette, a ship that had been crushed by ice north of Siberia in 1881, had drifted and eventually washed up on the coast of Greenland 3 years later, thousands of kilometers away on the opposite side of the Arctic. That meant the ice itself was moving. There was a natural current drifting across the Arctic Ocean from Siberia toward Greenland. Nansen's plan was to build a ship specially designed to be frozen in the ice on purpose, not to fight the ice, but to be carried by it, to drift with the current across the top of the world, and if the drift passed close enough to the pole, he would leave the ship, ski to the pole, and ski back. His colleagues thought he was insane. The Norwegian government debated funding him. Critics publicly called his plan suicidal. He got his funding, he built his ship, he named it the Fram, which means forward in Norwegian. The Fram expedition begins. In June 1893, Nansen sailed north from Oslo with a crew of 12 men and a specially designed ship unlike anything ever built. The Fram had a rounded hull, designed so that when ice pressed against it from the sides, instead of being crushed, the ship would simply be lifted upward, like squeezing a bar of soap out of your hand. In September 1893, the Fram became locked in the ice north of Siberia, exactly as planned. Then they waited. They drifted, slowly, painfully slowly. The ice moved, but it didn't move the way Nansen hoped. The drift was taking them across the Arctic, but the path wasn't going to bring them close enough to the pole. By January 1895, Nansen had done the calculations. The Fram's drift would never get close enough. If he was going to reach the North Pole, he couldn't wait for the ice to carry the ship there. He had to go himself. On March 14, 1895, Fridtjof Nansen and his companion, Hjalmar Johansen, left the Fram. They had 3 sledges, 2 kayaks, 28 dogs, food for 100 days, and a one-way ticket into the unknown. The plan was to ski north to the pole, then turn south toward Franz Josef Land, a remote archipelago of islands north of Russia, where they might find a supply depot left by a previous expedition. Might. The word might was doing a lot of work in that plan. Could anything possibly go wrong? The push north and the turn back. The journey north was brutal from day one. The Arctic ice in spring is not a flat, smooth surface. It is a chaotic, broken landscape of pressure ridges, massive walls of ice thrown up when 2 ice floes collide. Some of these ridges were 10, 15 meters high. The dogs struggled.
The sledges broke. The men were soaked, frozen, and exhausted every single day. But here is the thing about Nansen that separates him from almost every other explorer in history. He was a scientist as much as he was an adventurer. He took measurements constantly. He observed everything. Even when he was suffering, he was learning. On April 8, 1895, Nansen and Johansen reached their farthest point north, 86 degrees, 13.6 minutes north latitude. That is approximately 400 kilometers from the North Pole. No human being had ever stood that far north in recorded history. It was a world record. It would remain a world record for the next 3 years. But Nansen knew they couldn't go further. The ice conditions were getting worse. Their food was running low. The dogs were exhausted. And most critically, the ice they were standing on itself was drifting southward, erasing their progress hour by hour. Nansen made the decision to turn back. Not to the Fram. They could never find the ship again. It had drifted on. They were turning back toward Franz Josef Land, to an island chain they had never visited, navigating by compass and sextant across a frozen ocean with no landmarks and no guarantee that the depot they were hoping to find would actually be there. They turned south, and that is when the real survival story begins.
The race against time and ice. The return journey was immediately relentlessly punishing. Their watches had stopped, both of them. When your watches stop in the Arctic, you lose your ability to calculate longitude accurately. You know you're going south, but you don't know exactly where south is leading you. Navigation becomes guesswork guided by science and instinct. The ice they were crossing was constantly moving, shifting, breaking apart. Open channels of freezing water called leads would appear without warning, forcing them to detour for hours. Then the leads would refreeze, and they'd have to cross new, unstable ice that groaned and cracked beneath their weight. The temperature dropped to minus 40 degrees Celsius. At that temperature, exposed skin freezes in minutes. Metal bindings on ski equipment become brittle and snap. Frostbite is not a risk, it's a guarantee, unless you're careful every single minute. Here's a detail that doesn't get mentioned enough. By May 1895, they had eaten most of their dogs. Not because they wanted to, because in the Arctic, at the limits of human endurance, you use everything available to survive. The remaining dogs were fed the weaker dogs. The men were fed the dogs. This is the brutal arithmetic of polar survival. By June, they had reached the edge of the sea ice, and they were able to launch their kayaks. They paddled through freezing waters, threading between ice floes, heading toward the islands of Franz Josef Land. Then the walruses attacked. This is not a metaphor. A walrus, an animal that can weigh over 1,000 kilograms and moves faster in water than most people realize, attacked Nansen's kayak and nearly capsized it. Nansen fought it off. He made a journal entry about it. He moved on. Polar bear hunting, survival on the ice. Let's talk about the polar bears. The Arctic in 1895 had a substantial polar bear population. And polar bears, unlike most large predators, do not instinctively avoid humans. They investigate, they approach, sometimes they attack. Nansen and Johansen encountered polar bears multiple times during their 9-month survival ordeal. These were not encounters where the bear ran away. These were close, dangerous confrontations with a 500-kilogram apex predator in its own environment. Nansen had a rifle. But in the extreme cold, rifles misfire, mechanisms freeze, ammunition fails. A weapon that works perfectly at room temperature becomes unreliable at minus 30. They hunted polar bears not just because the bears were a threat, but because they needed the meat and the fat to survive. Polar bear meat is calorie-dense. The fat provides insulation material and fuel for their small cooking stove. In the Arctic, you cannot survive on willpower alone. You need calories, enormous quantities of calories, just to maintain body temperature.
Nansen recorded shooting polar bears and using every part of the animal: the meat for food, the fat for fuel, the skins for additional insulation. This is not sport hunting. This is subsistence survival at its most elemental. But here's a fact that most people don't know about polar bear meat. The liver is toxic. Polar bear liver contains lethal concentrations of vitamin A, high enough to cause hypervitaminosis A, which produces severe headaches, peeling, and, in extreme doses, death. Nansen knew this. He was a scientist. He avoided the liver. That detail saved his life just as surely as his rifle did. Building the ice hut, 9 months in the dark. By August 1895, Nansen and Johansen had reached the islands of Franz Josef Land. They were on land, solid land. But there was a new problem. Winter was coming, fast. In the high Arctic, winter doesn't mean cold weather. It means polar night, months of total darkness. It means temperatures that drop to levels that make the sea ice journey look manageable. It means no movement is possible, no navigation, no survival. They had no shelter. They were on a barren, rocky island with no trees, no natural cave, nothing but rock and ice and the supplies they'd managed to carry. So they built one. Using stones, moss, walrus hides, and whatever materials they could scavenge, Nansen and Johansen constructed a small hut. Not a sophisticated structure, a survival shelter. The walls were stone, the roof was walrus hide stretched over a frame. The floor was covered with bear skins. The hut was approximately 3 meters long and about 1.8 meters wide. 2 grown men in that space for 9 months. They lit a small lamp fueled by bear fat and walrus blubber. It provided dim light and some warmth. The temperature inside the hut was still well below freezing for much of the winter. They stayed in their sleeping bag, one sleeping bag, shared between them, made from bear and wolf skins sewn together, for up to 20 hours a day to conserve heat and energy. Nansen kept writing in his journal. He recorded his thoughts, his scientific observations, his dreams. He wrote about missing his wife and daughter back in Norway. He was remarkably, almost unnervingly calm. Johansen later said that the winter was the hardest thing he had ever endured, not physically, mentally. The darkness, the confinement, the uncertainty about whether anyone would ever find them. Their diet during the winter months was almost exclusively meat. Polar bear, walrus, whatever they had managed to hunt before the deep freeze set in. They cooked it on their blubber lamp. They ate it half-cooked because there wasn't enough fuel to cook it properly. They ate every part of the animals except the organs they knew were dangerous. They survived. The impossible encounter. In May 1896, when the daylight returned and conditions allowed travel, Nansen and Johansen prepared to continue south. They needed to reach a shipping lane or a known supply route. Franz Josef Land was explored territory. British explorer Frederick Jackson had a base camp somewhere on these islands as part of the Jackson-Harmsworth expedition, but they didn't know exactly where Jackson was. On June 16, 1896, 15 months after leaving the Fram, Nansen was walking along the coast of one of the islands when he heard something extraordinary. Dogs barking. He stopped. Then he heard something else. A voice, speaking English. He walked toward the sound. Coming around a headland, he encountered a man in a thick coat walking towards him, Frederick Jackson himself, on a routine survey of the island. Jackson looked at this gaunt, bearded, filthy figure emerging from the Arctic wilderness and asked, "Aren't you Nansen?" And Nansen said, "Yes, I am Nansen." Jackson later wrote that Nansen looked like a man who had been through hell and come out the other side still walking. Jackson's ship took Nansen and Johansen south. On August 13, 1896, just a week after Nansen arrived back in Norway, the Fram sailed into harbor. The ship and the rest of the crew survived their 3-year drift across the Arctic Ocean. Every single member of the expedition came home alive. Not one death, not one serious casualty, in one of the most dangerous exploration expeditions in human history. Fridtjof Nansen didn't just survive the Arctic, he understood it. He studied it, respected it, and refused to let it defeat him. At a time when most people thought the North Pole was an abstract, unreachable fantasy, he went to the edge of the known world with a compass, a rifle, a sleeping bag, and the most dangerous thing any explorer can carry: absolute confidence built on absolute preparation. The next time you think a challenge is impossible, consider this. In 1895, a man built a hut out of walrus skin in the middle of the Arctic winter, ate raw bear meat for 9 months in the dark, and came home. Not just alive, changed, ready for the next challenge. The Arctic didn't break Nansen, it built him. If you found this story as extraordinary as I do, share it with someone who needs to hear that preparation and knowledge beat panic every single time. And if you want more stories of human beings who went to the absolute edge of what was thought possible and came back to tell the story, you know what to do.